Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Google Hangout from Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Society. I'm Heather Thorstensen, the Manager of Communications for Sigma Xi. In honor of Women's History Month, this Hangout features researchers who have recently published articles about studies relating to gender bias, particularly gender bias towards female teachers and female science students. We're going to discuss these studies and also possible solutions to gender bias in science, technology, engineering, and math. If you're watching this live, you can ask a question at any time by typing it into the right side of your screen. I'll start the Q&A option right now. And we're also going to be live tweeting this conversation on Twitter. And so you can see those tweets by following Sigma Xi. Our username is @SigmaXi and we're using the hashtag GenderGap. My guests today are Dr. Anne Boring, a researcher at Sciences Po in Paris, and Kelly Ottoboni, a PhD student in the Statistics Department at the University of California, Berkeley. They are two of the authors of an article that was published in Science Open. Also on the Hangout is Dr. Sara Eddy, a research analyst at the Texas Institute for Discovery Education and Science at the University of Texas at Austin, and Daniel Grunspan, a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington. They are two of the authors on a paper in PLOS One. Both papers' titles and links can be found on the Hangouts event page. So welcome to the Hangout, everybody.
Hi.
Let's start with the study from Anne and Kelly. First off, could you talk about how you defined bias in your study?
Kelly, do you want to start?
Sure. So our idea of bias was a systematic difference between ratings of male and female instructors, where that could not be explained by things like test scores or learning improvement.
Okay. And your study was looking at student evaluations of teaching. Could you talk about what those SETs look like for both the France and the US portions of your study?
Sure. So we had one data set from McNell et al. They published this in 2014, and they did an online experiment where they had 4 sections of courses and 2 teaching assistants, and students were randomly assigned to one of these 4 sections run by the teaching assistants. In 2 sections, they had the male instructor, and the male instructor identified himself as male in one and female in the other, and then the same for the female instructor. So in half the courses, students were, I guess, misled about the instructor's gender. And then at the end of the courses, the students were asked to do online evaluations of their instructor and rank them on, I think it was a scale of 1 to 5, on a variety of things like how clear was their presentation, how prompt did they return assignments, and how well did they teach me overall. And what we found was that there were systematic differences between how students rated the male identified and the female identified instructors, but there was no difference between the actual 2 instructors.
Okay. And then what about with the France side of the study where you were, Anne, I think you were looking at like 23,000 of these evaluations, is that right? Uh-oh, did she freeze up?
Are you here?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I was saying, yeah, the French part of the analysis that we did with Kelly and Philip was a reanalysis and an extension of a research paper I'm working on that's on the impact of gender biases and stereotypes on student evaluations of teachers. And I use the context of basically a natural experiment on a French university for which I have 23,000 observations for mandatory courses in which students basically do not self-select into the courses. And what I find in my original study, and what we also find here with Kelly and with Philip, is that students tend to rate their professors according to the professor's gender and according to continuous assessment grades. But if you look at the actual performance of students on a given course, so all students take the same final exam, and the final exams are not graded by the teachers whom the students evaluate. Well, we find that there's actually no correlation, basically, between how well students learn, how well they perform in a class, and the evaluations they gave. So that's why we're saying it's biased, because essentially the students are evaluating something else than actual teaching effectiveness. And here we're defining teaching effectiveness as the extent to which professors enable students to learn more. So we're arguing that if better teachers should yield better learning, so students should perform better if they had better teachers according to their standards. And basically we find that there's no correlation there.
Okay, so Kelly talked a little bit about what the course evaluations looked like in the US study with like the promptness. What kind of criteria was used for the French study?
So in the paper that with Kelly and Philip, we look at the overall satisfaction score. The reason why we focus especially on that score in that study is that that's basically the score that most universities use to show how well or to summarize actual teaching effectiveness. In my original study, I also look at how students evaluate teachers according to different criteria. So like there's a question about how prepared and organized the teacher was, or the teacher's ability to contribute to the student's intellectual development. And what I find rate professors more according to gender stereotypes. So like male professors are going to get better evaluations on their the class leadership skills or knowledge-related questions. Whereas female professors, they're going to compensate a little bit of their lower student evaluations of teachers by getting potentially slightly better grades on how prepared and organized they are, the quality of their feedback to students. So kind of everything that has to do with being warm, nurturing, if they're class skills, they're going to get high evaluations. I also more specifically find, and we confirmed this with the study with Philip and Kelly, is that male students in particular give higher ratings to male professors. So the direction of the bias is especially in that direction, that study. And actually in the US study, it was more female students who gave higher rate or lower ratings actually to female professors. Okay. So we argue that it's kind of difficult to correct mechanically for these gender biases because they tend to be very much dependent on context.
Okay. And so I was going to ask you about that difference between the French study and the US study. With the French study, the male students have the stronger bias for the male professors, and in the US study, it's the female students who do. And so what do you make of that difference?
I think there are too many factors at play to make any conclusions about what's driving it. You know, there are different types of courses. I think in Anne's data we found that the magnitude of gender bias differed by course. So that could be one thing. It's hard to say.
Yeah, so we also that's a part I hadn't mentioned as well. Is that I have student evaluations of teachers in history courses, microeconomics. So courses that are more in social sciences, but that range from more literary oriented or more humanities oriented to more mathematically oriented, which would be microeconomics. And the extent of the bias really depends on the course that's being taught. It also potentially seems to depend on the proportion of women teaching in these different fields. So like the one discipline in which the gender bias is less obvious or less statistically significant, that would be in sociology. And it turns out that that's the field in which there's a larger share of women who teach sociology compared to the other fields for which we have data. So an argument that we could make, but that it's still a hypothesis that needs to be tested potentially using other data, is that when you have more women, you're changing the stereotype of what the gender of the professor is within that field. And so if you change the stereotype, well, you also change the way that the students are going to perceive professors. We're still not talking about how effective the teachers actually are, but it's interesting to see that the dynamics are very complex.
And so the ultimate argument that your paper was making is that these student evaluations of teaching should not be used in personnel decisions. Is that correct?
Yes. So the main argument is that you're creating incentives that are a little bit strange when you're using only student evaluations of teachers to decide on the careers of lecturers. The impact can be large for adjunct professors, of course, whose contracts are renewed based on these evaluations. The impact can also be large for academics who are in tenure track positions, because it might also affect the time that they have to take to get good evaluations of teachers. And basically, when you don't have student evaluations of teachers, the only goal of professors is to do a good job and be effective teachers and be there in the classroom. When you add student evaluations of teachers, they have to be good teachers, but they especially have to get good evaluations. And those could be two conflicting objectives. Actually, today there was an interesting paper in the Washington Post that was discussing grade inflation. And quite obviously, when you see that when professors give good grades during the semester, they tend to get higher student evaluations at the end of the semester. So, I mean, you're creating incentives for the professors to be liked by their students. You're not creating incentives for them to be actually really good teachers.
And that was actually a point of your study, the grade expectations. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we have, and so we also did it with, we also studied that with Kelly and Phillips. In the data set, the way that, or the timing in which things happen is that first, professors give continuous assessment grades to students, then students evaluate their teachers, and then the students take the final exams and they get their grades on the final exams. So when they're evaluating their teachers, they know how well the professors are giving, or what types of grades the professors are giving them during the semester. So I mean, you could argue, well, you can't prove causality, but you could definitely argue that there's something probably going on there. And this is a finding that you will find in several studies, that there is a strong correlation between continuous assessment grades and student evaluations of teachers.
Okay. And so one thing that was interesting
I
about
know, Kelly,
this.
I don't know if you...
Oh, Kelly, did you want to add anything? Okay. One of the things that was interesting about the study as well was that when you were looking at the bias for how well the students were ranking the male professors over the female professors, it was also on, I believe this was in the US part, also on things that were objective, particularly the promptness of their responses. Is there anything that you'd like to explain about that?
I think this just highlights how ingrained the bias is. I mean, that's absurd.
So it was actually, just to explain a little bit more, it was actually, you could tell that they were at the same time because it was all electronic, correct?
That's right. Yes, the TAs coordinated so that they both did everything at the same, length of time, and it was electronic. So they hit send, it should have gotten there. So all students had things returned at the same time, and yet the TAs who identified as female got lower promptness ratings, significantly lower. That was one of the ones that was highly significant, I think.
Okay. And one of the things that your paper argues is that these student evaluations of teaching should not be used in personnel decisions anymore because you can't correct for the gender bias because the gender bias depends on so many factors. Could you explain what those factors are?
Sure. So, like we mentioned before, probably the type of course matters for whatever reason. Another thing is just the gender balance of students in a class. So you might suppose you're able to somehow measure the magnitude of bias that female students have against female instructors. How that bias will play out in the ratings will depend on how many female students are in a class. And so it's not just a simple additive correction for every female instructor. And the problem is you probably can't predict the magnitude of bias for any given instructor. There are also factors like race, that we weren't able to collect data on, and those have been shown to have bias as well. I think race and native language, if somebody speaks with an accent, they're more likely to get lower ratings. Older professors or instructors are more likely to get lower ratings. So who knows how these things interact to affect an instructor's SET.
Okay. And then one of the questions from your own study that I was thinking about as I was reading through it is, how do you know that the male instructors didn't receive higher evaluations from the male students because their teaching style matched the learning style of the male students? Could one of you address that?
So if that were the case, then male students should perform better on final exams when they had male professors, and it's not the case. We actually find a negative sign, it's not statistically significant, suggesting that actually the male students, if one gender of the professor matters, it would be actually that male students would perform better when they had female professors than non-male professors. So I think the fact that we can actually control for how well the students actually perform on a purely objective test that does not depend on the professor they're rating actually gives us that answer. Also, research tends to suggest that learning styles and teaching styles might be a little bit overrated. In any case, even if they do exist, differences in learning styles at least, well, I mean, it's not something that we find in the data.
Okay. And what about the connection between the student evaluations and how the student actually performed in the class? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the final exam is the way that the French study, the way that it is set up is that you have like 45 different groups that each evaluate their own teachers, so they're all in groups of like 20 students, and they all take the same final exam at the end. And the final exam is actually written by the main lecturer, who's not being evaluated because all the main lecturers in the context are all male. They are evaluated, but they're not part of the study because we had no female main lecturer to compare the results with. But so we're looking at the TA sections basically, and how students evaluate their instructors from the TA section. But then we know how well the TA lecturers actually manage to teach their students, in the sense that we can compare grades across the final exams. And so here we find that basically student evaluations of teachers are not correlated with how well students perform on the final exam. So that means that students are measuring something else and not teaching effectiveness when they're completing their SCTs.
Was that just for the French side of the study, or does that also hold true for the U.S. Portion?
That's the same thing for the U.S. data. All the students in the 4 sections took the same final exam, and we found no significant association between SET and final exam grades. So if the one instructor had actually taught better, then we would expect to see higher final exam grades, and that's not what we got.
Okay. So do you guys have a plan to continue this type of research at all, maybe particularly in the U.S., because I know in the U.S. portion of the study, it was a smaller sample size. Is there a plan to go for a larger sample size in the future?
I don't have any plans. I'm a statistician, so typically I'm not the one collecting the data, but I would love to continue working on this kind of problem. I think it's very important.
In the European context, there's the University of Maastricht that, so in the Netherlands, who did the same thing, looked at student evaluations of teachers in the natural experimental context. And the researchers are finding that male professors are getting higher evaluations, basically because the male students are rating the female professors lower. So it kind of also goes into this idea that, you know, culture probably matters, and each individual institutional setting also matters. So we're also arguing that this type of study should probably be run on every university that's actually using student evaluations of teachers, and it's kind of, you know, for the administration to show that they're not promoting professors or firing professors just based on biases.
Okay. And I noticed in the study that the funding, some funding for it came from the European Union's seventh framework program, and it was for the Effective Gender Equality in Research and the Academia European project. So, a European project that's working on these gender research projects. Kelly, do you know if there's a type of equivalent to that here in the US where there's a big effort here so that if people wanted to learn more about the US gender studies that they would go to that as a source?
No, I don't know that.
Okay. Sarah or Dan, did you want to jump in on that question at all? Do you know if there's like a centralized effort for gender studies here in the US?
Not that I can think of nationally.
Not to my,
Sarah, I don't know if you know of anything.
not really. It's kind of spread out. There is a site that's collecting papers on gender bias, and I can send you that link after the. I'm not sure that they're connected to any particular institution so much as it's a single researcher who's interested in this.
Oh yeah, that would be great. And then I can post it on the event page so if people want to look for that after the hangout, it can be there.
Sure.
Thank you. So I also noticed for Anne and Kelly on your study, there was a note at the end about how in France, the French Ministry of Higher Education decided not to use SATs in decisions that might affect tenured instructors' careers. So I'm understanding that to mean that in France, these aren't used to help with personnel decisions. Is that correct, Anne?
So they are used for personnel decisions for adjuncts, but not for professors who are tenured. Well, here basically when you're hired as a professor, you're an assistant professor, you're hired directly on a tenured position. So for tenured professors or associate professors, the only person who's allowed to read those evaluations are the professors themselves, and the only goal of those evaluations is to help them improve their pedagogy. But in no instance is the administration allowed to read those student evaluations because they're considered as private information.
Okay. So
But
how
for
does how does that tie in with your overall hope of what happens now that your analysis is out there? I know it says right in there you're hoping that it seems you want other institutions to take it the same direction.
I think the SET are good for measuring student satisfaction, and if you read the little bit at the bottom where the student can write comments or feedback, tips for future classes, I'm sure that can be useful. But I think they should only be used as a part of evaluating somebody's teaching. And so hopefully we've got that message across. Like, it's measuring a little bit of teaching effectiveness and a lot of other things. So it shouldn't be taken at face value.
And is there anything you wanted to mention there about your hope for what happens now that your study is out there?
So I hope that universities are just going to take student evaluations for what they are, which is basically a consumer satisfaction type survey. But it's not actually measuring teaching effectiveness. So if universities really want to measure teaching effectiveness, they need to do other things, like review the course material, read through the syllabi that professors use for their courses. They need to do some peer evaluations. So do some, that's basically what Kelly was saying. You cannot just evaluate teachers based only on those student evaluations of teachers. So if anything, I hope that the administrative practices and university practices are going to change.
What about for you, Anne? Do you plan to carry any of this research going forward in the future?
Yes, so I actually am in the process of running an experiment with a co-author on student evaluations of teachers, in which we did a randomized controlled trial where we informed some students, some randomly designated students, about the presence of these biases in student evaluations of teachers in a past context. And we're trying to see whether that changes the way that they evaluate their professors or not. So we don't have the results yet. I don't know how that's going to, whether just informing students that they are being biased in their evaluations, if that actually changes their behavior or not. So we'll see how that happens. So I think that more generally, the way that I'm going forward with this research is that a lot of these gender biases are made completely unconsciously. The students don't know they're being biased, and in other contexts, the professors don't know they're being biased as well. So it's important that universities understand how biases are going to affect both their academic personnel, but also student trajectories. And I think maybe we can discuss that a little bit later about, kind of how students make educational choices in the university context.
Okay, yep, that's a good segue to our next group of researchers, who is Sara and Dan. And rather than looking at how students had a bias towards teachers, like Anne and Kelly's study did, the study from Sara and Dan and their co-authors was more about how students looked at other students. So could you also start, Sara and Dan, by talking about how you defined bias in your study?
Dan, I assume you want to take this one?
I can take this one. So yeah, so very similar to Anne and Kelly's study. We're looking at now how students are evaluating a set of teachers, they're evaluating their peers, and they're evaluating who they think is strong in the course material. So in our case, a bias would mean that they are using something other than things that you would imagine would help them get to this. So we want to control for something like how well are students doing in this course, because that is a direct measure of how well they know the material. And so what we're looking at is there a bias towards one gender? So that this is what we're looking for in bias. Are students biased to nominate a student of a certain gender over another?
Okay, so you were asking the students who they think were doing the best in their class.
We say who do they think is strong in the course material?
In the course material. Okay. So talk a little bit about how you did your study and what you found.
Sure. I actually have some slides to pop through, so I'm going to pop those up. Just
Okay.
makes it a little easier for everybody, I think. And is that coming through?
Not yet. Oh, yep, there it goes.
Okay, so what we're doing is we did this study in 3 different iterations of the same introductory biology course. So biology is actually the most female, numerically majority of the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, math fields. Biology has more than 50% of the graduates are female. So we did this at the University of Washington, and this is the second course as a part of 3 introductory biology series. So students come into this class, a lot of them already know each other from the first course, which is a prerequisite. These are really big courses. One of the courses we did this in had 196 students. The other 2 had about 760 students in them. So these are really large lecture courses. And what we do is our courses here are 10 weeks long, and you can imagine that these ominous green lightning bolts are exams. And on the first week of the class, we'll ask them, list any students that you feel are particularly strong at understanding course material, or that will be strong at it. So we kind of get this baseline reading, who do students think are going to do well in this course. And then after each exam, we ask them, can you update us? List any students in the class you feel are particularly strong in understanding class material. And then we do this after the second, third, and fourth exam. So what we end up with is this longitudinal network data. I'm lying to you a little bit. In the 3 courses, we only collected this much data once. In the other 2, we either collected 4 or 2 networks, but we're able to still see what are the patterns. So we can look at what a whole class looks like by looking at something called a sociograph, and I'll explain what we're looking at here. What you see here is...
Hey, Dan, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're still on the first slide. Is that what we're supposed to be looking at?
No, you're not.
Okay. Thank you.
Wow, that did not work.
Now I can see it.
Okay, let me see if I can zoom in and we'll do this instead of going slideshow. Yeah, so what we end up with is this graph called the sociograph. And each circle is representing one of 759 students, so there's 759 circles. And these turquoise circles are males, these orange circles are females. And the size of the circle is going to correlate with how many students are saying that student will be strong in the course material. So this is week 1 of a 759 student course. And at this point, this is a 55.4% female class, so there are more females than males. It looks not too bad. After the first exam, it now looks like this. After the second exam, we now look like this. And after the third exam in this class, which is the last time that we asked this question, it now looks like this. So at this point, you can quickly see that there are certain males in this class that have received many nominations. And we don't really see any females having that happen. This was only one course, though. If we go back to the course of 196 students, when we asked them this question at the same point in the quarter, it looks like this. Again, this is a 56% female class, so most of the class are female. But again, all of the largest circles, all the best-known students are male. And then the last class that we've done this in, it is not as extreme, but again, this is now 58% female. This is a very female majority class. The largest circles are still male. So we have a couple main results going on. First, when we look at this, we have all these celebrity students. They tend to be male. And when we are actually able to sort of dive into this more, what we're finding, and I suppose this won't work so I don't have the animation going on. But essentially what we find is that when we look at who is nominating who, females are actually nominating equitably between genders. What we're finding is that males are over-nominating their male peers. And what we do is we have to control for certain things, like what is the grade in the course. We asked professors to basically tell us who in this class is outspoken. So this is kind of a gross measure of who's actually speaking up in this course. So we know, in general, who is really speaking up, so we can control for that. And we also can control for the lab structure in the course. So we know that students are more likely to know students. In this class, I'm going to explain, it's a huge lecture hall, but they meet up every week in a 24-student lab for 2 to 3 hours. So we can control for that structure as well to help control for some familiarity. After we control for all that, we find that males are just using gender as an indicator of who is going to be strong in the material. Females don't. It's not a significant predictor. When we look at how strong it is, so if we were to compare the importance of gender to males to the importance of grades, we find that males are over-nominating their male peers as if they had a 0.76 GPA point difference. So males, in effect, are looking at a male student with a 3.0 GPA at about the same rate that they would look at a female with a 3.76 GPA, for example. So we find this huge bias, and we find it is particularly because males are over-nominating males.
And something that you wrote in your paper is that even just increasing the number of females in the classroom is not going to fix the problem. Like some people think we just need to get more girls in STEM to help with gender bias, but you're saying that that's not the full solution.
Yeah, so we're doing this in biology where typically, a lot of past gender inequity work, people just don't think about biology. They think more about physics or, math, chemistry, these other STEM fields, or engineering, where it's really male majority. You walk into a classroom and you can visually see, okay, there's inequity here. When you walk into a biology undergraduate class and you just look around, you're like, oh, this field looks better than others. But kind of underneath that female numerical majority, we're finding inequities are existing. So.
And I thought it was particularly interesting how the bias gets stronger as the year goes on. Do you have any thoughts about why that happens?
So there are a couple things. So one of what I thought was really interesting when we first started running these models is one of the predictors that really ramps up as the quarter goes on is this outspoken variable, which makes sense because at the beginning of the class you don't know who's speaking up. By the end of the class, you've experienced who's speaking up in class, and that predictor gets stronger and stronger. And we know not only actually from these the professors' lists, but previous work that Sara has done with some other colleagues has shown that in these classes, males speak up way more than females. So we think that there's, beyond perhaps just implicit biases that exist in these males, there may be things going on in the class. And this is, I think, one of the things that we're really concerned with. Sara and I are both really interested in just science education and pedagogy and what can we do to bring equity to course rooms, we're thinking that perhaps something is going on in the class that leads students to overrate their males beyond just an implicit bias. And that's, I think, a really big concern of ours.
And you guys talked a little bit in your paper about those class environments and some things that might be able to help. And you gave a couple examples. Do you want to share those examples now?
Sarah, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. We looked at a couple different things, and I do want to say that they're probably band-aids at this point, right? They're just kind of things that an instructor can do to help out, but not getting at the kind of deeper problem going on. One of the things that some prior research that I've done with other colleagues has shown the way the instructor actually calls on students in class can influence who's participating. So if you ask for volunteers, like Dan brought up, even though we did a study across 27 classes, so even though in these classes the average proportion of women was like 59%, only 39% of the voices heard answering instructor questions were female, right? And so if how outspoken someone is important for how their peers view them, then we have a problem. An alternative to asking for volunteers is cold calling, right? So actually calling on students by name. And cold calling is used in a lot of different fields. And actually, there's been some evidence that there's bias in cold calling, that instructors tend to call on males more when they use that method. So taking it even a step further, we have instructors that are using something called what we're calling random call, where they come in with a class list that's been randomized, and they go down that list and call on students. And students can opt out, right? If they're not comfortable, they don't have to answer. But what we see is when instructors use that method, we actually get responses that are in proportion to the gender presence in the classroom. And so that particular thing seems to be helpful.
There were also things I think I read in the paper about how there were affirmative, like if you had the students, the female students, write like affirmative notes to themselves, that would help.
So there's been some research, mostly in math at the college level, but Carol Dweck has done work looking at sort of the mindset students hold about their own abilities, and that if students who believe that you kind of reach a threshold and then you can't get any better, those students tend to not perform as well in difficult classes, relative to students who believe that if you just practice, you can always continuously get better. And so there's actually interventions that you can do to change students' mindsets, or at least impact them, and kind of push them a little bit more towards that fluid mindset. And so that was one idea we had for influencing sort of the gendered experience, especially around grades, because we do, again, in the study of 27 courses, we found that female students consistently underperformed relative to their male peers, even when you controlled for their performance in other college classes. So there's something going on in biology that was sort of disadvantaging female students, and it was about 3% on exams. So not a huge difference, but it was systematic. And so our thought was maybe that this intervention or interventions like these could impact that grade difference, which would help us, right? Because in our model, grades predicted whether you perceive someone as strong in biology. It could help us at least control for that variable.
Okay. And
so there's a whole series of these interventions.
Yeah. So another thing that was really interesting about your study was how it was the males who were ranking their male peers higher, but the females were doing it equally, male or female, higher. And so you write in your paper about how in the US, the male STEM majors hold the strongest associations between being a man or maleness and being in science, whereas the female STEM majors show some of the weakest implicit bias between gender and science. Do we know anything about why female STEM majors show the weaker implicit bias between gender and science? And if there's a group of females who do they have a similar characteristic?
Yeah, so there's The papers that I'm referencing there are work by Nosik using the implicit bias test, which is a test you can actually go online and take. And so because it's kind of an open analysis, my impression is that there are background variables on the folks taking these tests necessarily. But what they did find is that, like you said, women in STEM tend to hold the weakest implicit biases towards males in STEM. And I would guess, and this obviously this would need to be tested, that when you yourself break that association, when you see yourself being good at STEM and you're being told that you're good at STEM, that may help you break that link. Whereas for males, they see themselves as representing that link between male and being good at STEM, and so that may reinforce that cycle. In terms of sort of gender bias in STEM, we do have evidence from, there's another paper that shows that white women tend to hold a stronger bias against women in STEM than, for example, black women, that implicit bias is stronger for white women. So there do seem to be other characteristics that impact this bias, for sure.
Okay. And your study found that this bias existed in the undergraduate level. So for anybody who's interested in doing something about this bias, they would have to be looking at interventions before the students get to college, maybe like in the K through 12 phase. How much of those efforts do you think that we would need to do to have an impact? Is anybody looking into that kind of research?
There are definitely a lot of people looking into kind of bias and when it starts developing, and trying to think about interventions. I think that's probably one of the more active areas. And it develops early. So my favorite example, and this is kind of an older study, but they asked kindergartners to describe a scientist, and the kindergartners all described sort of a white male with white hair, and the hair is kind of all wild, and wearing a lab coat with an explosion in the background, right? So by the time you're in kindergarten, these students have all received the same message about who is a scientist, right? So it really is about starting early and getting other messages out there in the media, through families, through reading, through TV, of what it is that a scientist looks like that can be out there, and who is legitimate, right, as a scientist and who is not.
Mm-hmm. And so for both of you, for Sara and Dan, what is it that you're hoping that comes out of your research now that it's out there?
One big thing is certainly awareness. What's been really cool is that a lot of people have read this and are starting to talk about this and thinking about their own classrooms or classrooms that they're in, and really just sort of raising the awareness of how implicit bias can be affecting a lot of things in academia. So what we're really worried about, we asked one question: who do you think is strong in the course material? This is very possibly a reflection of what is going on in these peer interactions. So if two males and two females are in a study group, and we just see a lot of deference going on between the males, this may be a subtle signal that goes on every day to female students, right? That may tell them, maybe I don't belong here. And it may not be a huge thing, but something that's subtle that goes on every day in biology, and maybe it's going on every day in their chemistry class. And this could be leading to what we call sort of that leaky pipeline, where we start out with more females in STEM than we see in the end. So just kind of having this awareness that this is going on, these kinds of peer interactions, you can all kind of join in, because this awareness is the first step to being able to overcome this.
Sara, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I completely facing activity, and we're really hoping to use this to kind of encourage folks to have conversations about what they as instructors can do, what departments can do to really change the culture.
Okay, Sarah, you were breaking up there, but I heard you say that you want this to start conversations within departments and instructors about what you can do to change the culture. Okay.
Yeah,
Do
exactly.
either of you plan, yeah, do either of you plan to continue with this type of research?
We've been discussing it, and there's been a lot of interest in having this go on. I mean, I think our study is at one university, it's in biology. There are so many things that could be affecting this. There could be many biology classrooms out there where this is not happening. There could be biology classes out there where this is way worse. So I think understanding, does instructor identity matter? Does the content of the course matter to these sorts of biases is really important. So we've been discussing this. As you might imagine, like most academics, we're all under a pile of things to do. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to fit this in. But it's something that we definitely want to be involved in.
Okay. And I see Sarah left and joined, so she might be having a little bit of technical
Yeah.
problems. Um, in the meantime, I wanted to ask everybody, all four of you, if you think that these studies are getting to a broad enough audience where we're going to start being able to see a lot more change happening, and if you think that the results are getting to the people that they need to get to.
I think they are. Both of our articles were published in open access journals, and I know our paper has gotten a ton of views. I'm sure the other has as well. And I hear from people on campus like, "Oh, my mother-in-law sent me your paper." So it seems like, a lot of people are having a look at it. And as more and more of these studies come out, they keep popping up in the news.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few papers also that are being published on this topic. I'm thinking about so I think that the paper's not published yet, so it's still a working paper, but it's still accessible online by Heather Sarsens, and she's a PhD student in economics at Harvard. She looks at so it's not about students, but it's how academics, how their work is being valued, whether they co-author papers or whether they write solo authored papers. And so what she finds is that when a female economist writes with a male economist, and so when she co-authors a paper, that paper is going to count less for her tenure than for the male co-author. So he basically gets all the credit for the work that they did together. So that means that basically, women, if they want to signal that they're competent, it's easier for them to signal competence when they're single authoring a paper. Whereas when male co-author papers together, they both get credit for the paper that they are co-authoring together. And I think that's really interesting because one of the reasons why these stereotypes and biases have so much impact is because we don't know that they're going on. I mean, that type of research actually shows departments, look, you are being stereotypical in not finding that this woman who co-authored her paper probably didn't do her share of the work when actually she really did. So I think that there's a lot of research going on in that direction that's interesting. On the other hand, I find that if you look at the literature on gender biases in student evaluations of teachers, this is a huge literature. And I mean, you can trace papers from the 1980s that talk about this issue, and we're still using SETs to a very large extent in universities. So I hope that this momentum is going to continue, and that universities actually are going to decide that they want to tackle gender equality in each institutional context, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay. All right, and I want to remind the audience, because we're getting down to the last 10 minutes of our Hangout, if anybody has a question to ask one of our speakers, you can type it into the right side of your screen, and I will read it to the speakers that we have today. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about, we've talked throughout the whole conversation really about some ideas for what can be done and what we hope to have done from these studies that could help with the issue of gender bias in STEM. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Dr. Eddy. You have done diversity training, and that has helped you a little bit with some ideas about this. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So in particular, I participated in a program that's called a Search Advocate Program, and it's through the Office of Equal Opportunity and Access at Oregon State University. And this is a really neat program where they train folks to sit on search committees for like tenure track positions and to be a diversity advocate. And it really, the point of the position is to help deal with unconscious bias and help the committee avoid making decisions based on this bias. And message that we try to get across is this idea that is that really when you're making decisions fast, when you're making decisions under stress, that's when your biases tend to come up. If you can slow the process down, if you can think really deliberately about things, that's when you're less likely to show bias. And so it's a lot about kind of slowing the search committee process down a little bit, thinking deliberately about the criteria that you're asking to select people on, strategies of actually comparing candidates to each other rather than comparing them to an abstract ideal actually reduces bias. That one was a little unintuitive to me in the beginning, but it does actually seem to help. And so this entire program, and I'm sure you could learn more about it through them, is really focused on increasing diversity at the faculty level and really helping out there with bias.
Okay, great. And then, Anne, you have done a workshop to help women and prepare them for the professional setting. Would you like to share some of the tips that you give or the points that you make in that workshop?
Yes, so so what I do basically, it's a short workshop, so I don't have a lot of time to actually go into the detail of how techniques about negotiation or how to be more influent or show power. So the conference that I make, or it's a workshop for students, is that I basically explain to them how the professional setting is very different from the setting that they know at the university level. So very often at the university level, students do not perceive gender biases or gender-based inequalities, and they're not really trained for what's going to happen when they enter the professional world. So basically, when you're a student at university, if you want to show that you're competent, you're going to work hard, you study, you get good grades, and your grades kind of speak for yourself, even if you don't raise your hand or you're not outspoken. So you're going to show your competence through your grades. When you enter the professional world, well, you don't have those grades to signal your competence. And when biases and stereotypes tend to play a larger role in situations of incomplete information, and typically when you enter the professional world, you're there in a situation of incomplete information. So you need for others to know that you are a competent person doing your job correctly. And there are plenty of techniques that are being developed by researchers. Most of my resources are actually from the Lean In website. So you have some professors from Stanford mainly who present their tips and advice that's research-based to help women, negotiate better when they're negotiating for themselves. Like the research shows that women tend to negotiate very well when they're negotiating for others or for colleagues, but when they're negotiating for their own wages or their own promotions, it's really hard for them to do that. So just realizing that also culture has had an influence on the way we behave in these types of settings is going to influence your behavior. Well, you also have techniques to counter that, and you need to know that they exist.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I checked out that Lean In website, and it has some helpful videos, and they would be good to watch too. And then you had also mentioned to me that you were doing a study that's not published yet, but that you wanted to talk about a little bit.
Yes, so it's actually part of the workshop. So students don't necessarily realize that their choices are also gender biased. And so these students, they all went through a process at the university where I work for, which is Sciences Po, where they all have to choose a university where they're going to study abroad for their third year as students. And with my co-author, who's Jen Brown, who's at UBC, we look at male and female students' choices for the universities that they say they would like to attend. So students have to rank 6 different choices, 6 different universities that they would like to attend. Essentially, they get a a slot or one of their choices depending on their grades when they were first-year students. And what we find is that the top female students tend to ask for universities that have a lower ranking than top male students. And the female students don't realize that they could actually ask for better ranked universities. They seem to be believing that they wouldn't get those universities, and so that's why they're not asking for them. So what this research is actually telling them is that, well, you shouldn't be necessarily risk averse, or you shouldn't be at least self-censoring, whatever the reason is behind there. If you would actually like to attend a better ranked university, you should actually try to ask for it, and then maybe you actually will get it. And it's interesting to see that the male students do not self-censor. It's really the female students who do. And also, we also find that since the female students are basically not asking for the better ranked universities, the male students tend to disproportionately get into those universities because they do ask for them, despite the fact that some, better female students in terms of grade would probably have had those slots had they asked for them. So in a more larger context, I think this research also shows that basically universities have unique rules for all types of students, and these unique rules are actually going to have an impact on student trajectories. So here we're looking at gender, but if you're looking at different types of minorities, you're also going to see that a institutional framework is going to have a large impact on what students do within their 4 or 5 years of studies in higher education.
Okay, great. And one thing that I wanted to bring up earlier that I forgot to bring up was in the Sara and Dan study, they talked about how addressing the gender bias is important because these male students who are ranking their male peers higher than their female peers might go on to become the professors later on in their life, and then they would carry on this bias forward. So I don't know if Sara and Dan want to say anything about that. It kind of looks like they're might be both frozen. I think that they both are, but I just wanted to make that point because I thought that that was a good point from the article. Yeah, I think that they both are.
Are we frozen?
Oh, there you are, Dan. Yep, there you're back.
Yeah, I think also Anna and Kelly's study, it's the same thing. One of the things when we think about this, when we found this, it's like, okay, well, this is affecting the classroom now. But what's also really scary is I think I naively, before I ever thought about this, just assumed that because I'm part of a new generation and there's another generation, that the adults in 20 years are going to be totally free of bias, right? And then everything's going to be okay. But here we find, 18 to 22-year-old students in both cases displaying the same bias that we've seen current faculty hold. So we have to realize, all of these students are going to be leaders tomorrow. They're going to be doctors tomorrow, right? They're going to be professors tomorrow. They're going to be making hiring decisions. So assuming that they don't have an implicit bias is dangerous, right? We've now kind of shown in both of these studies and other studies that, undergraduates are holding these same biases now. So we need to keep being aware of this because, in the future, the people making these decisions will, be having these implicit biases.
Yep, great. Okay, well, we're about out of time. I don't know if anybody had any closing thoughts. Does anybody want to say anything else about their studies or anything like that? It looks like Dan, you might be the only one who's not frozen right now.
This was fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming on and talking about your research. For anybody who wants to get the Twitter recap, we will post that later this week. So watch at Sigma Xi Society on Twitter for that. For anybody who's interested in watching any of this again, it's going to be immediately posted as a recording on the event page and also on Sigma Xi's YouTube page. So it will be there as an archive. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.